Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Special Codes. This is episode number 7 of our language series that we're doing on setting a foundation for what we're going to be talking about for future episodes. Today, the topic is specifically on CSS. My name's Nathan, and this is
Taylor.
And he is going to take it off to kind of introduce us into a basic understanding of what is CSS, and then we'll kind of connect it to what it means and how it helps us to be human. Taylor, take it away.
Okay. So CSS. Last time we talked about HTML, and CSS really goes along with HTML because CSS is what makes things look pretty. And CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheet. So it's basically a language that allows you to style all of your elements in HTML. So last time when we talked about HTML, we talked about it being a series of boxes within boxes that you can put stuff in. Well, CSS is basically all your stickers and your paint and your drawings on the sides of those boxes to make them look good.
It's all the tags, how you make it look good. Now with cascading, what does that word cascading mean?
So in this instance, it really means it goes everywhere. In order to really understand this, I should probably explain what the point of CSS is and why it was invented in the first place. So HTML allows you to style everything perfectly fine. You can go into an element and you can put in a style there and style it however you want. However, when you have big pages or a lot of pages in a website with a lot of elements, a whole lot of boxes, and you have to go in and style each and every one of them, and some of them have duplicated styles, the HTML code gets really bloated and looks really bad and gets jumbled really quickly. And you have to keep typing the same things over and over again.
So you could make a wrong copy and paste somewhere in the code, or make something an error and you wouldn't be able to find it because there's so much text there.
Right. You would have to hunt down the one place you made the error if there's an error. So CSS came along to solve all of that, because CSS is basically its own section or its own page where you can put styles into it and connect those styles to tags or classes. And classes are basically just ways of labeling things in HTML. So for instance, I can go into my CSS and I can say class A, determine what happens in that class, like the font color, the size, the width, the height, that kind of a thing. And then in my HTML, I can put a class tag and say class A. So everywhere class A is called, it will automatically pull in that style. So instead of typing out my style everywhere, I can just call a class that's been pre-set up in my CSS, and then that'll automatically pull in everything that it needs. So that means instead of a huge page of HTML all jumbled with styles, you can have a page of pretty easy to read HTML, all calling classes, all calling what they need to. You can have your CSS in a separate file, and you can go to CSS and it's all there, see what all the styles are. And if you need to make a change to a class, say for instance, you need to change the font color on all of these of class A. Well, in the past, you had to go back and in every single element, you had to go change that font color.
Ugh.
In CSS, you just go to class A, change font color, and that cascades through everywhere that calls A. That's why it's called cascading style sheets, because it flows through everything. Once you make a change, it flows through everything everywhere.
Anything that has that class A, it'll automatically change everything because you made the one change in the CSS. You don't have to go to every single element in the next one. That's really nice and makes it a lot easier to do it. So is there any cons or anything that could I mean, this sounds like too good to be true. I mean, like making life easier, making it cleaner, sharper, crisper. I mean, like who doesn't want a well-oiled machine, right?
Right.
What could be wrong with this?
Oh, let me count the ways. So there are cons to CSS that can be pretty frustrating. For instance, let's say you have a page of elements, a whole bunch of boxes. They all have to be styled differently. Well, if every single element on your page has to be styled differently anyway, CSS is just an extra step where you have to add the CSS style block or the page, and then determine the classes, determine this and that and everything, and then go in and add those to each individual element, and each individual element is going to be different anyway. I mean, it's still best practice to do that just because it helps future proof, but it's just an extra step in some cases that can be annoying.
So it's kind of like if you have an assembly line and you're putting stickers on the boxes, it's like each sticker is individually created for that box, and you're spending a lot of time creating the sticker to put on the box when you could have just written on the box.
Pretty much, right. But don't get me wrong, it is still best practice to always create a CSS page and call that. Because even in cases like that, if you come back to it in the future and want to add things to it that happen to be the same, you've already future-proofed that. But that is a con for some projects where everything needs to be different. CSS is just an extra step to do. Now, there's another con to CSS. Because it cascades through everywhere, you can come in and say, oh, the elements here need to change their size. So you go into the class that element calls and you change the size. Well, what you might not have realized is that class is also called somewhere else on the page or on a different page, and your size change has just messed everything else up. And so everywhere else, because it cascades through everything, now everything is messed up because you wanted to change it for these two instead of everything else.
God done messed it up, Ron?
Yeah, indeed.
Oh man, that doesn't sound like anything anybody would ever do in real life. You know,
Oh, never.
never overgeneralize something that would actually cause negative things. Actually, that's kind of what connects to what we've been talking about as we were thinking about CSS, and it relates to humans. One of the things that really stuck out to us was this ability for us to, instead of like, because I mean, like, think about the relationships that we have with people around us, and if we were to tag or have specific tags for every person that we interacted with and made, like, oh, let me get to know you and write a tag for you, I mean, that would take forever. I mean, like, every interaction that we ever had, that would be just a lot. So in a lot of ways, we as humans kind of do a CSS file in a way. And as we were wrestling with this idea of how do we as humans create CSS files, well, this kind of comes from our generalization of people by how they look or how they identify themselves. Because remember, CSS is a styling thing. And we have to be careful with this as we're talking about people, because we're not saying necessarily who a person is inside. This is not talking about the generalization of people based on who they are inside, correct?
Correct.
Right. Because when we look at a CSS file, it specifically deals with the generalization of appearance or understanding of something, right? So for instance, like, and I know some people may or may not like this example, but I'm a Niners fan. Go 49ers, right? And already by mentioning that, some of you are going, yeah, and some of you are like, oh, seriously? That right there is a great example of a CSS file that you have created as humans.
Anywhere class 49ers is called, use this style.
Yeah, like the style is, or react this way. Like, this is how we interpret this information, and that's the CSS file that's gone there. Now, the information that I'm sending out to people about the 49ers and that they receive from me, is the 49ers are the best football team on the world. Now, even just that, though, another word came up there that people are like, wait a second, what? And some of you may have caught it, some of you may not have, but football, right? That's another word that might be a CSS file that some people might struggle with there, in the sense that like football in America means something different in the rest of the world. And so with CSS files, whether we recognize it or not, we have created for ourselves a file, and it contains within it our biases and our misconceptions, or the way that we overgeneralize a lot of things. And I think that we really need to make sure that when we're talking about these, because when we talk about biases or misconceptions, we can really say like, well, you don't know the person. Remember, CSS file is about appearance, correct?
Correct.
And so we want to be careful in this conversation to make sure that we're not saying like, we're jumping to a conclusion to say like, well, we're making overgeneralizations because we know these people super well. No, that's not what we're saying. CSS is, for instance, class A. Anywhere in our lives where we see class A, we would interpret that or see that with a certain light, a font. We've filled in our CSS file for what that is.
CSS is basically just how the specific box with that specific class, it doesn't have to be class, that's just the easiest thing that I'm using as an example. Any box with that class looks this way. So it's very much a styling thing, in that we, in ourselves, anytime we hear or see a certain class, we see things a certain way. Whereas people, when they want to put that class out there for themselves, they are stylistically presenting something that they think they are presenting. Here's another fun thing, because CSS and HTML runs on your browser and on your machine. So technically it is very dependent on what you are running and what you have whenever you go to a website, what you actually see, which can result in sometimes some differences, especially between older browsers or older machines and newer ones.
We were talking about that specifically. A great example of that sometimes has to deal with font.
There was an example where I wanted to use a specific font that wasn't necessarily commonly used or already in browsers or known by browsers. So I had to get the font styling files and put them into the program so that when anybody went to that website, their browser could pull everything that it needed from the page. Because when you go to a page, you are basically, and keep in mind this isn't a tutorial, I'm just giving you basic concepts of how things work. It's not going to be exact. Your computer, your browser downloads the HTML code and the CSS and all of that, and then interprets it and runs it. And so when I say download, it's not necessarily like, oh, I go download this file and suddenly it's on my computer. There's a cache in your browser, like it's where you have cookies and all that it pulls everything in, and then it can use that. So when you're programming and you want to use things that are unique to your program and aren't already just generally included in browsers already, you have to get those files, you have to include those so the browsers will download them. Because if you don't do that and you just start calling them, it may work on your machine because you have them, but it's not going to work on anybody else's. So what you think you're presenting is not going to be what other people see. That kind of leads into what we're talking about here with humans, where what we think we're presenting may not necessarily be what other people see.
And I think there are some definite pros to doing this as a human, in the sense of, oh, kindness, these people, this group have some of these kind of traits. But there are some things that we as people start to do when it comes to our own CSS files and receiving these kind of things. And so when we're talking about this, so for instance, when you were saying downloading a font size or downloading those kind of things, for some of us, when it comes to what is seen, we have as humans this really interesting thing that we do or we've created within ourselves. Now, sometimes, and I know this is kind of crazy, and if you talk to people about counseling or other things, there are codes that we have created inside of ourselves that we run without us even knowing it, in the sense that we have as a young child, or there are so many instances where we have code in our lives that we don't know necessarily why these things are doing. So for instance, one of the codes that I've seen a lot of times that is incredibly misunderstood, and it was actually really hard for me to recognize that even I had this code in my life, but also how to handle it when I saw this in other people. And it has to deal with our defense mechanisms. So when there are stressful situations, how people respond to that appearance of stress or something harmful to us, especially when it comes to conversations, is really interesting. In relationships that I've had and I currently have, when I am about to get into something that's stressful or potentially emotionally vulnerable for myself, one of my defense mechanisms that my CSS inside of me, when I see this coming, I immediately go to comedy or laughing, trying to make the situation funny. And for some people, if they're angry at you and you're laughing, it makes everything better, right?
Yeah, great.
Because on their side, what they appear to see is what?
You don't care. You're not taking this seriously.
Right? And no problems ever come from those messages sent, right?
Oh, never.
Never. And here's the thing is, like, the code that I have as a person put in for my defense mechanisms is when I see this coming, boom, I'm doing this. Boom, this is what's happening. And so, like, when we think about these innate generalizations of certain things, sometimes a really good thing to do is to recognize yourself, but also other people. I work with a lot of special needs students too. And so, within our conversations that we do, one of my own ways to diffuse stressful situations or challenging or overcoming things is I get really sarcastic, because it goes back to that comedy thing, making things funny in the midst of something that's not fun. Well, for people who don't have the ability to interpret sarcasm, what do you do with sarcasm?
We were sarcastic a little bit ago, so
Right.
some people who have trouble with sarcasm might take us seriously. What? What? You mean there's never a problem when somebody starts laughing? No, that's not what we're actually mean.
Right. And this connects directly to our own and the CSS people file of people around us. And I think one of the really crazy things about CSS files, and specifically as we're talking about humans and ourselves, as we think about our own CSS file, when we have created something in our file, it cascades through our life and how we perceive or do things. So, for instance, I mean, I can't tell you how many arguments or things that I've had to diffuse because of a cascading file, in the sense of when somebody's laughing at me in a stressful situation. You even just did this. I mean, it's crazy to think about. You went from your cascade as you thought about me laughing at you in a stressful situation. You went from he doesn't care about me, he's not taking this seriously, which then can lead to a bunch of other overgeneralizations about the individual. And we do this. We all do this in a sense of in different areas of our lives, where somebody will send out an appearance of something. And whether we know it or not, we interpret it with our own CSS file. And this is where we get into some really tough stuff, because what was as a kid or what was as something general to help us through situations, for instance, oh, making a joke got me out of trouble, and doing it over a couple times. Well, if I see the code trouble, I'm going to always now do comedy. My CSS file has said go to comedy, go to laughing. Or another one too might be when I feel depressed about myself or my self-confidence, or people might notice something about me that I don't want them to, distract. with either making fun of myself or doing self-harm, or there's a code that we put into these things. And a lot of times we start to do it so much that that code cascades into a lot of our lives, because we all face trouble. We all face this. We all face stressful situations. We all face times that are just boring. I don't know, the simple things. And if our CSS file interprets that in a way that the world around us can't understand, we need to make sure that we do some work in that of just ourselves. And I think of when we're doing the nitty gritty of self awareness, this is one of those hard ones to go into your CSS folder, because a lot of times when, and even just as I was talking about this, things came back to me. When we go into this code of stressful situations, why do I go to comedy? When we go into that CSS folder to address some of those things that need to change, a lot of times it also connects back to those really hard times. And it's hard to do because it brings back emotions, it brings back memories, it brings back some things that we may not want to deal with. And yet, if we don't do the nitty gritty, the hard stuff, things come back to bite us.
Anakin Skywalker is sort of an example of when you change one code, sometimes you have to change more than one, because if you don't, bad things can happen.
Oh, so this is when we do adjust things, the cascading effect and
Mhm.
the negative effects of it too. And I think that's something that we need to be careful with. Is I know when we leave high school and we're in college and we're adjusting some of our philosophies and theologies of certain things or our understanding of the world, we want to really be careful with the codes that we're changing, because the influences of people, this is why choosing a wise counselor is good, because if your counselor is Emperor Palpatine,
You can change your codes for the worse.
yeah.
Well, and Star Wars is really, really an interesting, when you actually look at the story of it and how Anakin, spoilers by the way, Anakin Skywalker is Darth Vader.
Woo!
I'm sorry.
I,
But
I
if you actually look at the story of it, it wasn't just an immediate, oh, I'm going to be Darth Vader now. It was very much a things kept changing, small things kept changing around him and influencing him. And so these little code changes may have seemed small, but they really ended up having a huge impact because they cascaded through everything.
And that's a really important thing for us as we're thinking about digging into our CSS files. Be careful with this, because it can really change. I mean, it can change you for the good or for the bad. So it's really important to choose your mentors and the people who are able to help you understand your code, what messages you're sending out, and what messages you should send out. It's really important for those things to happen, because, well, and two, I think as well, when we think about the great heroes of our world, what's the messages that they sent out? What's the CSS code that they lived by and that they did? Now, not every person in this world is perfect, right?
Right.
And so there's going to be codes that they sent out that we find out were wrong. But I think looking at the effects of a person, what codes they sent out, really help us understand some of those things. Now, if we get to the nitty gritty of what they did wrong all the time, I think we can really lose the heart of the person. We got to be careful with that.
Everybody does things wrong. When that's the thing, we tend to focus more on the negative than on the positive. Like, for instance, you can spend 5 years cultivating a relationship with somebody, but you can ruin it in 5 seconds because the negatives really, really stand out for us. You can do 100 good things, but one bad thing, and now your name is mud.
Right. You're on a list that people can
Mhm.
search up. I think there's some real tough things in that. And I think that when we talk about this CSS file, we don't want to lay heavy on the negative, but we want to also recognize that there is a caution, there is a con to going into your CSS file. And one of that can be it cascades through your whole life. And if you change a code that is negative or bad, those are subjective words even, but something that little by little it cascades, and it can lead you to the dark side.
Well, even in your example, making a joke got you out of trouble. So you changed your CSS. So in trouble, make joke. That was what you would present humor as your style. There were situations where that was appropriate. CSS files in your life don't change just because, well, sometimes they might, but in this case, your CSS file didn't change just because. Your file changed, I would say, almost appropriately to accommodate for a certain instance, for certain things. It did not account for a lot of other things that it would break by doing that. So that's the thing that you have to be careful of. There may be an instance or a few instances where that CSS, that styling is appropriate for that class. But you have to take a look at everything else too.
I think actually my change in my introspection for my own CSS file, and I think this is something that's really powerful about this. I didn't necessarily change, and still, even when stressful situations come up, I get more sarcastic and I still lean into comedy. But the thing about it is, I was mediating two people in the middle of a conflict. And what was clear evidence was what they were perceiving as each other's actions and then how they reacted to that. And in the midst of that, for myself, I realized my own comedy is a defensive mechanism, but also other people do that to me. And it kind of opened up this awareness that my generalization of how people react in situations of stress isn't black and white. So my file, even though I updated it, I didn't get rid of comedy. I read the room, and I started to recognize too of within myself as I'm interacting with people, not only what message am I sending, what appearance am I sending out to them, but also what am I receiving? Because when I get stressful messages from people, I tend to become defensive and I become hurt and I can react in a way that's not healthy for them.
I think we all do that.
Right. And I think that when it comes into these kind of situations, my CSS file was rewritten because I was able to have and see like, oh, other people respond differently to this. And I need to be aware of how people respond so that I can properly interpret it.
To bring it to programming, there have been a number of examples where you have a whole bunch of areas, a whole bunch of elements of a single class that do need to have a change. And there are instances where elements with that class shouldn't or don't need to change or need a different change. That happens all the time in programming.
Yeah.
It's just the natural progression of things. You'll be creating what you're creating and keep adding more elements, and then more and more situations will arise and more things will be added. And there are ways of handling that in CSS. It's really easy to just do a blanket change on a class without taking everything else into account. It's
Right.
really difficult to go in and really determine what needs to be done and how to account for everything you need to account for. Sometimes that means creating an entirely new class and separating those classes out. Sometimes it requires making little changes, sub changes to different things. There are more complicated things you can do with CSS that I'm not going to get into, but there are ways of handling it. But
Well, and I think that's important to note is at some point, and this goes back to your comment of CSS is really helpful in the beginning, but eventually sometimes it might be better to have a separate file for certain situations like, oh, this is a angry, stressful situation. This is a productive, stressful situation. This is a blah, blah, fill in the blanks. And I think as leaders, people really need to be aware of that because as we're thinking about people who are investing in other people, making decisions for things like that, if a leader of a team doesn't know how people are interpreting what he's sending, or he or she, I should say, is sending the message out to people, and doesn't also understand how who they're leading responds to them, if there's not an understanding or a common CSS file that they can all operate out of, a lot of times this is where we have tension. There has to be a common CSS file that we all operate out of so that when we see this tag, this is what's going to happen. And sometimes it's helpful in organizations to have that, but also to identify and clarify and maybe sometimes create sub things. But we need to know, how do we, as an organization, as leaders, as people who are working with one another, understand the code around us? And I think one of the things that we have is that we need to understand our own CSS file. That'll help us understand who I am, but also help us understand other people's CSS file. Now, it's not like I'm going to sit there and say like, hey, everybody, here's my CSS file, right? We're not going to, what would be the issue if I went out and I said, oh, here's my CSS file. Here's my CSS file. Here's my CSS file. Hey, everybody, here's my CSS file. What would happen in the coding world? What happens?
In the coding world, when you create a website, you have a CSS file. Everybody who goes to the website that uses that CSS file. However, if you were to create a situation where for whatever reason you decided to create a new CSS file for every single person and just randomize everything would get real jumbled real fast because nobody's using the same CSS file. Your HTML might be the same and have the same classes in it and whatever, but if there was a situation where everybody had their own CSS file and were looking at it, no two people would look at the same website and say that it looked the same.
Which that's what we see in humans, right?
Uh-huh.
Right. I mean, in coding, it doesn't happen often because we kind of do that a little bit. But I mean, like, think about this. If I were to go somebody say, this is my CSS file and this is the only file I want you to see. Anybody else that you interact with, don't care about them. This is how you see the world.
Well, you would basically get this huge database of CSS files for every single individual person that you meet with. Your internal process would get overloaded. You'd spend way too much time trying to find the correct CSS file for each individual person, because how many billions of people are there out on the planet? They all want you to have their own CSS file that you specifically use for just them. The storage space isn't there to handle that in the first place. Then even if you could, looking that up would take forever. You just get a huge mess and nothing would get done because everybody just be sitting there going, oh.
Well, and the other thing is the cascading effect is like, oh, I got a new one. Shoot, no!
It's everywhere.
No!
Man. Like, okay, so maybe you could accept individual CSS files from people you know really well so that you know when you see this person, this is the file that they're running. You know how they're presenting. You know what that means. But you can't do that for absolutely everybody.
Right. It would be ridiculous. And that's why it's really important. But think about this for just a second, too. If in what you just said is really important, there are a few people who we should be giving our CSS files to. Not everybody, and who we should be receiving. But for instance, in important relationships like, let's say, a marriage, and neither person gives each other the CSS files, what's going to happen there?
If you don't know how to interpret the other style, you're not going to get the data you need.
Talk about misunderstandings. Well, and the other thing, too, is in that relationship, a willingness to recode yourself.
Right.
Like, you have to be willing to add little codes, add little adjustments, change things here and there to make those codes work together. Because if you're supposed to be a unit of operations working together in marriage, in that kind of relationship, you work as one, which might not be the understanding of marriage for everybody. But if that oneness doesn't have CSS files that mesh together and they operate completely separately, how well is that one going to work?
Not very well.
It's two individuals still. Like, there's no way that they're going to be able to properly understand each other. And that's a hard one to see. And part of this, the cool thing that CSS files do is it helps us understand who we are and help other people understand who we are. And those other people should be important people in our life. I'm not just going to have the person who's checking me out of my register at the grocery store. Hey, here's who I am. That would be a really awkward conversation. Like, hey, Joe, I know that you just scanned my potatoes, but I want you to know I'm a Niners fan, I'm proud of it. You wouldn't tell Joe Schmo your deepest, darkest secrets.
No, you don't want to walk. Every time you walk up or interact with anybody, you have a piece of paper say, "Here's all my CSS."
Well, yeah, I mean, even with Joe, for instance, again, and I got off a little bit on that. Remember, it's appearance. And so if I were to go to Joe and say, hey, Joe, when I say Schmuckers, that means I'm in a really good mood. Joe's going to check me out. He's not going to remember. I mean, he may remember that because it's the weirdest conversation he's probably ever had. And he's going to shoot her Schmuckers. Well, that's why. Okay, so this is one of my favorite ones. There was this game that we played in high school and college. And many of you guys, just by hearing this, have already lost it. And it's beautiful because in this recording, the purpose for the game is that if you know the rules of the game is if you think about the game, you've lost it.
I just lost the game.
Right. Yeah. This is the best part about this recording is that there's a lot of you that are now listening going, oh, and I'm winning because I'm no longer thinking about the game. But
well, you are now.
Well, right now I am in this as I'm recording this, but people who are going to listen to this, they're going to sit there and be like, oh, I lost the game. Shoot. And that's the CSS file. We've presented a game, a CSS file that when you hear the game or you lost, and people react a certain way. That's the CSS. When you hear the game, you lose. And some of you have just lost the game like 7 times by listening to this episode, and you're welcome.
We make no apologies.
That's the game. You don't apologize for being awesome like this in a recording and saying you lose the game.
Well, to go back to just general human interaction and CSS, if we effectively went to everybody and gave them our CSS files and they gave us their CSS files in any interaction, well, just from my perspective, every time I had to interact with somebody, I had to learn a new CSS file. It would just be exhausting for me to interact with people. Like people who are insistent about, oh, you have to know this about me, this is my favorite brand of ice cream, and they always have to tell you everything about themselves when just scanning your potatoes to check you out at the cash register. You're an exhausting person, and I don't want to interact with you. Now, if I really know you, like you're my friend, and we're talking, and you tell me these things, then I want to know because we're friends, and we're interested in that way.
Well, and two, I think you talked about, and I know this is kind of connecting to computer, but when we talked about receiving CSS files from people, if it's people we care about and we've invested in, we've already allocated memory and storage space for that person.
Yes.
There's already something there for them. Joe Schmo from the cash register, I don't have any space for him. And if you're going to do that, trying to create space for that when I haven't done it, it's like, it's exhausting. It's I mean, thinking about a computer, if there isn't the memory that's been allocated for that, and it's not something that's been like accepted as forced on you, even that is even more exhausting. And so for people who aren't people, the introverts in the house, when somebody you don't care about comes up and gets all excited, you don't have the memory space to deal with this person.
That's the thing, like if I don't know you and you come up and say, my name is so-and-so, my favorite brand of ice cream is X, I've already forgotten. That's just me. I'm terrible remembering names in the first place, and if I don't know you and you come up and tell me your favorite ice cream, I don't care. So...
Right, you just don't have the mental capacity to do that on the fly, nor have you done that. Now, for some of us, now here's the flip side, though, is that for introverts, the people that they care about, they've dedicated that space to them.
Yes.
And it's in there. It's part of you. So like our relationship is for extrovert like myself, and this is a negative thing for me. I'm talking about something negative for me, who just let anybody and everybody and want to know everybody and everything. It's really hard for me to dedicate CSS files for people. And it's not that I don't care about them. It's just that I care about everybody. And I don't have the hard drive for everybody. And so I'm sitting there receiving all of these files, dumping files that I didn't think I needed. So I'm sitting there, somebody who I cared about 10 years ago comes back into my life and they're like, don't you remember all of this stuff? And I'm sitting there going, dude, I don't know what I did 5 minutes ago. I'm just looking for the next person.
And as an introvert, it's hard to get to a point where you accept a CSS file. It's almost the opposite problem where extroverts accept too many and they get overwhelmed. I think introverts have the reverse problem where they accept too few, or it's harder to accept.
That's a good observation.
Because there's probably a lot of people that I've interacted with in my life that I probably could have been good friends with, but I'm an introvert. I just don't really pursue people.
Well, and two, I think it would have helped maybe too with some of those minor, like identifying somebody who has a meaningful like work relationships. I think that's one where it happens a lot of times is like if I would have invested and realized that and accepted this person's CSS file, the issue that I'm now facing with this person probably could have been avoided because the way I interpreted or didn't interpret or didn't understand the things I was sending to them or whatever the case may be. Now, that's not saying that all work relationships you need to accept all the CSS files in the world, because if we did that, even in our work environments,
it's very easy to get overwhelmed.
Yeah, even just in this conversation, I'm sitting there thinking like, man, if I were to do that with my brain's going, does not compute, stop, it's already tapped. So, but I think these are really great things. And remember, guys, as you're listening to this, we're starting a conversation in this. We're setting a foundation for the language that we're using. So when we talk about CSS files, what we're talking about is the thing that's behind that we perceive or that we're sending a message, whether we know it or not. And that's really the purpose for this episode, is to say with CSS files, as we're connecting the coding to ourselves as humans, this is the behind the scenes of what we present or what we perceive to be presented. And I think that's the heart, the meat of what we want people to take away from our CSS conversation, is that this is the back door that overwhelms a lot of what we see around us, our overgeneralizations, biases, those kind of things of how we see the world, but also how we perceive ourselves and send that message out to people, known and unknown. Well, hey, everybody, I think Taylor, do you have anything else to add?
Don't go to the dark side.
Don't make those little changes that do it. Bit by bit, you turn. They don't get you in one fell swoop. So don't turn to the dark side. And for those of you who are leaders out there, I really encourage you to maybe review your own CSS files, but be more willing to receive the people you're leading CSS files and understanding what messages they're sending and how to interpret those. Because sometimes, I would say a lot of times, what people are doing is not always what we think they are doing or saying. All right. Well, we'll see you next time on episode 8. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Have a great week.